Hi everyone, welcome back. This is Hamid, and today's day 6th of learning web development. So let's get started. Hi. Totum. Hi. Thumbnail. Click.
Let's move on to CSS media queries. Media queries allow you to modify your site based on specific characteristics and parameters, and most often we look at the browser viewport width. This is key to responsive design as our web pages will respond to the width of a device viewport. So let's look at the starter code. I have got some basic HTML here, and I have a page outline that has a header, a nav inside the header element, a main element and a footer element. And so we're just going to outline a page and see how it changes based on viewport changes. And then in the CSS, I've got some basic CSS here. We're importing the going to outline a page. Let's look at the starter code. I have got some basic HTML here.
So we have a header, then we have h1, which is we have nav. Inside this nav, we have h2. Then we have main h2 main.
Here, and I have a page outline that has a header, a nav inside the header element, a main element and a footer element. And so we're just going to outline a page and see how it changes based on viewport changes. And then in the CSS, I've got some basic CSS here.
In this CSS, we have the CSS wizard and body में हमारे पास है font 1.5 rem, new Nito, San, but we have font size, font family. Oh, font size and font families, new Nito. Then we have San, serif. Then we have min height, which is 100 viewport height. Import is https://fonts.google.apis.com/css2 family is equal
Here we're importing the Nonito font from Google. Other than that, we have the basic CSS reset and a basic style. A change you may notice is I'm using the font shorthand property now that sets both the font size and the font family all in one right here in the body. Other than that, min height of 100 viewport units. Okay, before we do anything with CSS, we really need to look at the HTML. There is a meta tag here that enables responsive design, and that meta tag has the name viewport. And you can see the content is width equals device width, and then initial scale of 1.0. This is necessary to enable our media queries and allow responsive design in our web pages. Now, do you have to memorize how to type that out? Not really, because VS Code helps us a lot. I'm going to just select everything quickly with Control A, cut it out of the page with Control X, so I have a blank HTML page. And now in VS Code, if I type an exclamation mark, you can see it says IMID abbreviation. When I press Tab, it fills out the basic skeleton of an HTML page, and you can see it includes this meta tag with the name viewport, the content with width equal to device width, and the initial scale set to 1.0. It's very important to have that as we work with responsive design, and Visual Studio Code helps you do that. I'm going to press Control A now to select all of this, and then Control V to paste over and just go back to the page outline that I already had with the header, nav, main, and footer. Control S to save, and we're ready to move on to the CSS. Okay, before we add any actual CSS to what we already have, let's just talk about the syntax of a media query first. So I'm going to paste this in and look at the syntax. That is how we write it. So we start out with @media, and then we give the media type, and then we specify a condition or conditions, as we can link those with logical operators and or. And then we specify a breakpoint, and that depends on the condition as to what we already have. To move on to the CSS. Okay, before we add any actual CSS to what we already have, let's just talk about the syntax of a media query first. So I'm going to paste this in and look at the syntax. That is how we write it. So we start out with @media, and then we give the media type, and then we specify a condition or conditions, as we can link those with logical operators and or. And then we specify a breakpoint, and that depends on the condition as what type of breakpoint we'll use. There's lots of different types of breakpoints and conditions we can apply. And then, just like we do with anything else, we put the CSS rules between the curly braces. So now that we've looked at that syntax, let's go ahead and write a media query and see how that applies. So we could start out with @media, and instead of media type here, we could say screen. That is the most common one you'll see. You might also see all or print or even speech for screen readers and devices that read the screen back to you. And then after condition, or as the condition I should say, you often see min width. And you should read min width as starting from. So whatever the width we specify is, these styles will start from that width when we say min width. Likewise, max width would be up to, so the styles would apply up to the width we would provide if we said max width there. We usually do this with min width, and that is because we design from the smallest to the largest, and that is what is called mobile first design and responsive design. And the reason we do that is, well, think about it this way as an analogy. When you get a box, you unpack something, it's often hard to put everything back in the box the way it was packed and get the lid to close. It's kind of like that when we design a page. It's easier to start with the smallest and work our way towards the largest, rather than start with the largest and then try to squeeze everything into a smaller and smaller box, if you will. So that's kind of the analogy I use to explain that. So we'll start out with a mobile device screen. Usually that's a one-column design, and we can spread things out as we go. So for this first min width, for the breakpoint, let's say I would put, and remember this is starting from, so I would put something like, let's go with 481 pixels. So all of our styles before this media query would be applied until we got to 481 pixels. And then they would still be applied unless we were to overwrite them, because the cascade still works. So here we could change something maybe about the body, maybe the font, maybe a background color, and that's what we'll experiment with today because it's so easy to see those background color changes. And then we can overwrite the previous style we had. Other styles, if we do not overwrite those, they will still apply if they were applied before the media query. Now, as always, I'll give a link to the MDN references in the description below, but let's talk about some of the other conditions and breakpoints we could have, although, as I've said, min width and max width with pixels as a breakpoint is very common. But you could also have something like orientation, and then you would set that to possibly landscape, which would be kind of turning your phone to the horizontal instead of the vertical orientation, something like that. There's also something like min-aspect-ratio. And there you can actually set a ratio. And there are many different sizes of phone. So while landscape would actually apply to anything that was wider than it was tall, here we could set something more like specific, like 16 by 9 or say 7 by 4, something like that. Then when the aspect ratio reached that size, so the width would be 7 and the height would be 4 in that ratio, or 16 by 9, or whatever we put, that is when that would apply. Now remember, we can also put more than one rule here, and we'll look at that very soon as well. So how do we decide what breakpoints to apply and what values to use? Well, there are some common ones, and we can also look at some CSS frameworks and see what they have applied, because they have probably researched that and worked with it a little bit more than we have. So let's look at what some others have done. I'm going to open up the file tree here. You can see I have a notes.md that I'm going to include in this repository. .md means markdown, so it's a markdown file. When I click on this, you'll see the outline here, but I'm using an extension, and if you want to get that extension, it's called Markdown All-in-One. You can search for that in the Visual Studio Code extensions area, and then you can install it if you want to use that as well. So when you have Markdown All-in-One, then you can go ahead and preview the markdown, and that's what I'm going to do with Control Shift and the letter V. And now I've got a markdown preview, and this is how GitHub would read our markdown. So I've provided a table here. So some common media query breakpoints. You can see mobile devices are often considered to be 481 pixels width or less. And then from 481 to 768, usually iPads, tablets, 769 to 1024, small screens and laptops, 1025 to 1200, desktops and large screens, and 1201 and greater extra large screens and TVs. Now that's just kind of a common general guideline. Of course, there are no standards, so you can set these how you want, but let's look at what the Bootstrap CSS framework does. And I tend to like these, and I guess maybe I'm just used to these, but 576 instead of 481, as we saw referenced above, is considered extra small. And then anything greater than 576 is small, 768 and above is medium, 992 is large, 1200 is extra large, and then they have a second extra large, which is double XL, at 1400. Now, Tailwind is another CSS framework that is very popular now in recent times. And you can see they've also differed somewhat. They consider the extra small to be less than 640. Maybe that's because in recent years our devices have seemed to have grown into larger sizes. After that, 640 and above is small. Now we meet up and agree at 768, and that is where the iPad is usually at, the traditional iPad. And then we've got 1024 here, which is a little different than 992 as far as Bootstrap was concerned, then 1280 and 1536. So you can see even professional opinions vary, and you can set your breakpoints how you want to as your page needs to respond. So it can respond to the content. You can work with your content and set the breakpoints according to that. You could target specific devices, or just use some general guidelines as well. Let's go back to the CSS now and start to write some code, and we'll see how this applies. Okay, I'm going to drag Visual Studio Code to the left, and we can see our page on the right. It currently has very little applied as far as styles, just our CSS reset and our basic body styles right here. And then we have our media query. I'm going to hide the file tree with Control B so we have a little more room to write code. I'll go ahead and remove this media query for now, just so we can start out with our basic page first. And remember, we're designing for the smallest screen first, and we'll work our way up. So we'll just put in some basic styles here. The easiest thing to see as we're learning about media queries is to change the background color. And let's do that by first setting a background color here on the body. I'm going to set it to 475569, kind of a nice grayish color. If we save that, we can see that doesn't highlight our lettering as well, but we'll change this, of course, as we change media queries. And now after that, we can change a little bit about how this displays, as we learned in the last lesson about images. So we'll set background image. And now instead of linear gradient that we learned about before, there's one other one I would like to show, and that's called a radial gradient. And now this starts in the center and works its way out instead of top to bottom, bottom to top, left to right, or right to left, or any direction that we would send a linear gradient. This will always start from the center. I'm going to use white smoke as the first color, and then we'll use that color that we specified as the fallback background color for the second color. And when I save, now you can see it lightens up here in the center, and it works its way out to a darker color on the left and the right, top and bottom. Now let's make, well, I'll put a semicolon there. Let's make our body a flex container, and then let's set the flex direction, and we'll set that to column because row is the default, and we want our elements to stack instead of being a row. I'm going to scroll for a little more room, and now let's go ahead and identify each piece here. We have a header,
background color. If you want to play flex, then we have made flex direction is to column.
a nav, a main, and a footer. And we will apply this style to all of those elements. So we'll set each one of those to display grid, and then we'll center our content by saying place content center. And when we save, now we see that has been saved in the center of each one. So this really means we've stacked our elements and nothing is below. So we want this to take up the full page, and we'll take that on here very shortly.
Display grid, place content center.
So I'll scroll for some more room here on the left, and now I'm going to put a style on just the header and the footer, and here we'll say position sticky, as we want these at the top and the bottom. Let's identify these with a different background color, and here we'll say 1E293B. There we go, a little darker.
Sticky.
But then let's give the font the color of white smoke as well. Identify these with a different the footer, and here we'll say position sticky, as we want these at the top and the bottom. Let's identify these with a different background color, and here we'll position sticky, as we want these at the top and the bottom. Let's identify these with a different background color, and here we'll say 1E293B. There we go, a little darker, but then let's give the font the color of white smoke as well. We can save that, and now we can see our header and footer. And remember, the nav is nested inside the header. And now we've applied position sticky, but we didn't provide the other value that we need to stick the header or the footer in a specific position. So here I'm going to say header now, because it will have a different position than the footer. We'll say top 0. And now that is in the same place. But after that, we can come down below and say footer. And here we'll say bottom 0 and save. And now, right now, it looks like it's in the same position because we haven't expanded the page. But the footer will be stuck to the bottom and the header will be stuck to the top. And we can see the difference in that. I'll scroll for a little more room. And in our main element, and it is a flex item right now as it's inside the body that is a flex container, we can say flex-grow. Set that to a value of 1, and now the main element has grown to fill out whatever space was available. Now before we move on to a media query, let's go ahead and style the nav just a little bit more to make it stand out. So let's give it a background dash color, set that equal to white. After that, we'll set its color or font color to black. Let's give it just a little bit of padding here, 0.5 rem, and let's give it a border bottom, and let's set this a little thicker, 2 pixels, solid black, and let's see what we get. Well, that looks good, except we don't quite have the width we want yet. We can easily solve this by going back to where we placed the grid on each of these elements, the header, nav, main, and footer. We've got it centered, but we don't have block elements at this point that are 100% width. So let's add grid-template columns and set that to 100%. Now when we center, those are actually give them 100% width, and we've centered them. And you can see main is centered here vertically, but it's not horizontally now. But the elements do have 100% width, and this is text content, pardon me. So we just need to say text align center, and now we get everything where we want it.
So this guy. Grid template columns 100% restore. Then this line is center. Nav bomb deleting him. 2 pixel solid. So solid black. Then color is white. Background color is I don't know, so it is same.
But we actually have 100% width for each of those elements once again. And now we have our basic page layout. So let's go ahead and add a media query.
So we have background color white. Color is hashtag black. We have the padding 0.5 rem. っせえなお前。うっせ。なんで？
Query now that will change things up a little bit. So underneath our footer, we